Howdy, gang. Coming to you Sunday, the December 1st. Apologies for not getting the video up before now. I just jumped into the holiday selfishly, so a couple days late. Shouldn't harm anyone. This is for the Sunstein reading that we're going to be talking about here today. This was the reading we're going to be covering last Wednesday, and I wanted to get a video together talking through some of the key ideas here so you have it. I'll also be, before our review session on Wednesday, I'll be creating all the prompts that I've not been able to get to in the last third of this semester here, so you'll have all that ready to go for studying for the final. So it was kind of hard to find like the final reading in this class. As you know, this is the first time I've taught this, and I always like to leave the semester off on a kind of big bang, kind of like the big, the last hurrah, on a high, on a positive note, on a productive note, optimistic note, if possible. And it's hard to do for this class. We started way back thinking about general semantics and a lot of those basic assumptions, and then we've just been complicating and trying to deal with more of the actual complex dynamics of human social communication, interaction, and so on. Trying to really understand what it is that gets in the way of understanding, agreement, consensus, sort of shared sense of how things are going, commonality, right? We are in fractious times to these last few years, and so it feels important to at least get a better handle on what's underneath a lot of the failed communication that happens today and the failed cooperation. Don't forget, we just came out of Rushkoff talking about the importance of cooperation. We're seeing gridlock in Washington. We're seeing cultural polarization like I've never seen it. And so, the wishes of the serious man and the general semantics folks feel like a kind of distant dream. Like a nice kind of world to fantasize about, but there's so many problems and so many complications, and that's what we've been trying to reckon with, right? So this last reading is not the big answer. Wayne Booth gave us a little bit of a kind of feel for how to kind of embrace difference and diversity. Sunstein is giving us just I think of this similar to the Jonathan Haidt reading on morality and reason and tribalism. So he's talking here about the law of group polarization. This comes out of a book called How Change Happens, and I noticed this just recently. This is a very recent book, 2019. It's coming out of MIT, so this is a big league press and a big league scholar. Sunstein's top level social scientist, Harvard guy, Ivy League, worked in the Obama administration. This is the guy who was working on the nudging stuff that we talked about as well. So I was curious about this book, thinking about how do we get things done? How do we make change? The book's a little disappointing because it seems to be just a kind of cobbling together of a bunch of works that he's done over the years and trying to string it together on a kind of broad theme, slap an intro, slap a conclusion, then it's just a kind of bunch of stuff. And it's a lot of interesting stuff, but there's not a real kind of big coherent narrative to the book. And so I really struggled trying to think about which parts to assign, and finally just landed on group polarization because that sort of feels resonant with where we're at. So there's a core idea in this reading, and again it kind of echoes the Jonathan Haidt the chapter, and it's this, that what explains group polarization is sort of groups themselves. The idea being that if a group starts off at a moderate position but has tendencies toward becoming more increased, getting together as a group will intensify that inclination. if a group starts at a more extreme position and maybe has an inclination to be a little cautious about that extremism, then the group dynamic of like-minded types will back that dynamic away. But it's basically like groups are multiplication kind of machines, right? In terms of like, if the majority of the group is inclined in a certain direction, then the group itself will become more extreme than any particular member within that group. So groups intensify the inclinations of individuals, right? And there are upsides to this, but there's also downsides to this, and he's really kind of working through some of these subtle dynamics. So the key point on this first page of chapter 2 of the Law of Group Polarization, down at the bottom, he talks about tendencies. This is the key idea here. It's about tendencies, right? So if your tendency is leaning more extreme and you find people with similar tendencies, you are going to bring each other to that more extreme position. If your tendency is to be more cautious and you find folks of similar tendencies, the grouping will intensify the tendency. So it's just an actualizer of tendencies within individuals. Being together in groups gives that sense of confidence and shared meaning and purpose that kind of gives a kind of grounding to any individual's sense of purpose and sense of right and true that ends up intensifying one's contributions to the group dynamic overall. I think this is a powerful insight. It's simple. It's maybe even a little bit obvious, but it's really powerful, and I think it does help explain a lot of what we're dealing with. I got a glare on my glasses here. Let's see if I can see my screen in my glasses. It's kind of distracting me. Let's do that. I can barely see, but less distracting. All right, sorry. So, it's all about tendencies, and he talks about the possibilities of, if there's a group of fairly extreme tendencies, but you have some members who are vocal, who have less extreme tendencies, they can kind of mellow out the group, right? But it's all kind of where the overall dynamic is leaning. It's those leanings that matter here. So he lays everything out on that second page, page 20. All the key ideas for the chapter are in here. It says at the top there, groups consisting of individuals with extremist tendencies are more likely to shift and likely to shift more. So the group itself intensifies. It's not just a kind of gradual thing. It's like, I'm sure you've been in situations where you had a kind of leaning, like maybe you're suspicious or frustrated, or maybe you were inclined to think kindly or well of something. And if you find others who share and echo that, it really gives you that feeling of, oh, okay, they are also on board with this, so that means I've got to be right. That means we're all right. And if you can find enough people who share that, then, my goodness, that's gospel truth, right? So that can go in really positive directions, but it can also go in really scary, ugly directions, as I'm sure you know, right? So he says in the next paragraph, the principal mechanisms underlying group polarization, the things that kind of determine this. First, the role of information. Information tends to augment tendencies, right? And again, that can be kind of scary. He talks about argument pools or information pools, where the group will just sort of like, we're only going to read these people or listen to these people because they give us the information that kind of confirm our tendencies, right? So information matters, but it can also matter in kind of selective and filtered ways, right? Second is social influences. That's crucial social influence, right? Just like this feeling of belonging, this feeling of your identity, this feeling of who you're associating with, who you're not associating with. So much of like our group polarization today, left, right, fragmented within the sides, whatever, centers, millennials against Gen Xers and like baby boomers, all this fragmented stuff that's happening right now. A lot of it has to do with that feeling of who I am versus who I'm not, right? That intensifies these dynamics. Third, emphasizes the relationships among confidence, cooperation, and extremism. That's sort of an extension of the social identity thing, I think, right? It's like You feel more confident in your views when others share those views who you identify with. You feel less confident in your views if those who you identify with don't share those views, right? So it's just talking about the power of the group dynamic itself to shape your own individual perception about what is right, wrong, true, false, and so on. So this is pretty far from, general semantics talking about like just dealing with the thing itself, not worrying about intentional bias and error and all the weird stuff that can go on in our heads. What he's saying, and again what Haidt was saying, is like there are dynamics and forces that precede our ability to be rational. And in this case, it's that groupish quality that we all love and crave and want to be a part of. I want to be this. I don't want to be that. And sure enough, I find truth within this group or this enclave or whatever. It's a powerful thing. So then he finishes off by talking about enclave deliberation after he's gone through each of the like information, social influence, and confidence and so on. He finishes off talking about enclave deliberation. So at the bottom of 20 he says, one of the largest purposes, my largest purpose is to evaluate the social role of enclave deliberation, understood as deliberation within small or not so small groups of like-minded people. And he says, I suggest that enclave deliberation is simultaneously a potential danger to social stability, a source of social fragmentation, and a safeguard against social injustice and unreasonableness, right? So small groups getting together to really deliberate, and an enclave being sort of like a subgroup, right? A place of like withdrawal almost, right? So you can think of clubs, you can think of certain Facebook groups that take shape and they're private, back in the old day before the internet, it was like, going down to maybe a pool hall or some kind of, club or reading group or whatever. However you find each other, like-minded people to come together to deliberate, to read stuff, to talk about ideas and issues. He's saying that can be good or bad or ugly, basically, right? It can be an important part of social stability when that enclaved group is able to kind of come back and challenge and check, right? The larger kind of dynamic social terrain. They can mellow out that terrain, or they can illuminate injustices across that larger terrain. But they can also become more extremist in their own regard, and that can go ugly. And the alt-right kind of stuff and the neo-Nazi stuff that we're seeing. Coming to the surface, those groups that were more like deliberative enclaves, we didn't hear about them for a long time. Now all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness, they're marching in the streets and so on, right? So it's like, that's the ugly side. So these deliberative enclaves are important places where ideas can get like shared and challenged and reworked. And when they kind of surface in the larger social dynamic, it can kind of go in different directions, right? So the group dynamic is a kind of double-edged sword, rhetorically speaking, right? Where it can produce healthy, positive outcomes, but it can also produce really gross, extreme, nasty, consequential outcomes on the other hand. The thing that I wanted to latch onto as the kind of final thing to point to is the idea of the member of the group that... that outrage heuristic stuff was kind of interesting, right? This idea that we all have kind of scripts in our brains about like where things should go. This very gets back to the kind of the intuitive, impulsive notion of morality that Haidt was talking about, right? The idea that these feelings, these impulses, are always kind of in us, and then we find the reasons, and we find the facts, and we find the information, and we find the like-minded people that help kind of justify our impulses is pretty astonishing revelation, I think, right? I just wanted to like point out the depolarization and deliberation without shifts stuff on like 29. He says at the end of that first paragraph, if people who initially favor caution are put together with people who initially favor risk-taking, the group judgment will move toward the middle. So I'm a bit of a centrist type myself, and I think it's always important to have other perspectives, even when you're like convinced that you're right. That groupish sense of like righteousness is to me kind of scary. Doesn't matter where you find it, because at a certain point, the groupishness takes over, and the sense of righteousness takes over, and it kind of clouds out everything else. Anyone seen the movie World War Z or read the book? I've seen the movie. I read the audiobook in my car on a long trip, and I thought it was pretty great. And I was struck by the example of Israel. When they went to Israel, when Brad Pitt went to Israel and talked to this dude on the inside, and he was letting him know about this mechanism that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I loved it. I kind of wish it is, right? Coming out of, I think it was the Olympic Games Munich kind of fiasco, and the idea that Israel's like governing body was going to appoint one person, the 11th man, and the 11th man's single job was to disagree with whatever the others were saying. Like, to prevent the group from going off the rails, there was one person's sole job is to find a way to refute, even if he agreed, even if he wholeheartedly agreed with the outcome and the conclusions of the rest of the 10 members, he had to find a way to refute them. And so that, in the context of the movie, it's like we were hearing about these whispers about zombies, and everyone just thought, well, it was ludicrous. And this guy's job was to disagree and say, let's take this seriously. And turns out that the zombie outbreak was real, and they built a wall, and so on and so on. I like this idea of that having the one dissenting view. Doesn't matter where you are, what side of the spectrum, what group you're in. Groupishness, as such, is something to be potentially worried about in terms of polarization, extremism, blindness, group blindness, right? I think we see this a lot these days in terms of like groups sort of not talking to each other, assuming the worst of each other, using their own feelings of solidarity and righteousness as a way to kind of pivot against and away from others and to sort of look down on them. There's a lot of this going, even between generations. The whole okay boomer thing is, this weird, silly, like grandparents and grandkids like hate each other. And it's like, my goodness, it's really like nasty. And it's like, we could do better, right? I feel like we could do better if we moved more in that direction of having internally dissenting or contrarian views, operating within that cohesive social dynamic, that group dynamic. So think about that in terms of your own life. Think about the groups that you're a part of. Think about the things that you believe, like intuitively. Have you ever asked yourself, like, why do I believe this? Or is there a possibility that maybe there's another kind of perspective? It's healthy, I think. It's good perspective. And to me, that's what diversity really is this idea that, like, not just we are the people who care about diversity, but what about the person who might actually, like, challenge the idea that having diversity is, the only way? Like, just for the sake of argument, right? What else? What else might be possible? It helps temper the group. Seems necessary. Seems like it's always a good idea to have like a kind of escape valve, pressure latch that kind of lets out some of the steam of the group. So that's, I guess, where we're ending off this semester. 20 minutes, sure. So no solutions here. No easy solutions. But hopefully a better appreciation for how hard it is to do the things that the general semanticists were talking about in terms of like just talking about facts, only dealing with the extensional world, making sure that you realize that your intentional landscape is error prone and biased and da-da-da. Okay, it might well be the case, but here we are in our bodies, here we are in our own brains and perceiving the world the way that we perceive it. So it's important for us to realize just how much of that process is rooted in our I would say our physicality, our sense of vulnerability, our sense of primal kind of primary basic feelings of belonging and wanting to be cared for. Like these emotions, these moods govern so many of the like deliberations that we engage in and how we deliberate and the way that we process information. It's all kind of colored by that. which doesn't mean that we're enslaved by it, but we can be aware of it and try to constantly revise and do better. So I don't want to disregard completely the general semantics, goals, right? I believe that a shared world of relatable information is important. I believe that, checking, confirming, validating, is it true? Just because someone you like said it's true, is it true? Being cautious, being suspicious. These are good things. These are things we need more of. So there you go. We will reconvene tomorrow, and this is our final week of getting ready for the final exam, and looking forward to it. See ya.